Okay. Okay, so today's plan, a little bit of just a reminder of what I did 2 weeks ago. Then we'll talk about money, except there isn't any money. It's actually credit. Credit is what matters. And then critically, the mechanisms that actually uphold the dollar as global quasi-state money for a world economy that's centered on the US empire. Okay, so last 2 weeks ago, I did 1 and 2, which is why we need to have a system level approach. And that's important because ultimately where we're going to end up is talking about the dollar as the highest powered currency in the global economy. That only makes sense if you start with a system level approach. And 2 weeks ago, I talked about the dollar as the central currency for a global empire centered on the US. And again, you can only make sense of the dollar's role in a power political sense if you think about this as an imperial currency sitting at the top of a set of heterogeneous currencies, which is typical of most global empires. So that was 2 weeks ago. What I'll talk about today first is money, what money is. Money, very briefly, money is actually credit, and credit, of course, implies debt. There is no credit without a corresponding debt. There are no financial assets without corresponding financial liabilities. So this is always a social relationship. We are not talking about what, again, Angela Merkel thinks of as an asset, which is the pile of wood outside her, I don't know what you guys call dachas, but outside her dacha in the Swabian highlands, where she's carefully collected all this wood for the impending winter. That's not a financial asset. It's not money. So money is credit. Credit means debt. And as Merling has shown very nicely, all these balance sheets are interlocked because credit implies debt. Everything has to net out. And we'll talk about the implications of that in this 45 minutes. The second important point about money is creditors always want the most acceptable form of money to be the unit by which their credits, and therefore your debt, is denominated. So acceptability really matters. And critically, and this is why we talk about empire, it's states that establish what is, in a general sense, the most acceptable money when they accept it as tax payments. I want to say a few words about that right now. I am not trying to make an extreme chartalist or state-centered view of money where only what the state says is money counts as money. State money, state debt circulates side by side with private monies. If you look at the history here, what you see is a co-evolution of both forms in which the state actively encourages the creation of private monies in order to expand the economy. That is in turn the basis for public debt. But nonetheless, in that relationship, state money always has the highest degree of acceptability because the state ultimately has the power to coerce tax payments. In the next slide, you're going to see an asterisk around that, but that's the way I'm thinking about this. And critically, from a functional point of view, it's this state-validated credit or backstop for private credit that offsets chronic deflation in capitalism. So that's the perspective on money. Now we'll get into the details. Here's the critical thing about money. As Minsky says, anyone can create money, which is to say anyone can offer to become indebted to you. But the real question is, why would you accept that offer of indebtedness? Anyone can create money. Everyone can create money. The problem is getting it accepted. And this problem pertains also to state money at the bottom of the global monetary hierarchy. If those of you who are a bit older will remember $100 trillion. But if you don't remember that, don't worry about it. So the question is why actors out in that global economy ultimately will accept dollars, and as we see, will use it to denominate credit, meaning debt. Why do they do that? And again, remember, this is a power relationship. Jens can't be here, but I take the moment to quote Bourdieu, who says capital, and he's thinking here also about debt. Capital is accumulated labor, which when appropriated, and I have to put in parentheses, by elites, that's what he's talking about in the sentence, when appropriated by elites, enables them to appropriate social energy in the form of reified or living labor. Okay? So money is credit. Credit implies debt. Sorry?
That could easily be Marx.
I mean, it is basically Marx also. But I mean, for Jens, we do Bourdieu. He's a social theorist. He's on the other side of the line. So all money is credit. Ingham and Minsky tell us that. There's a varying degree of acceptability of the liabilities that there are the other side there. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, state money sits at the top of this hierarchy, and it functions as outside money. I'll explain what that word means in a minute, for financial systems built on fiat money. So the critical distinction here is going to be between inside money, outside money. Inside money is money created inside the financial system by private actors. As I said 2 weeks ago, unlike the old North American view, the view being put forward here is one in which banks endogenously create credit, they endogenously create money, and hopefully backed by some collateral. The mechanism here is I come to the bank with some amazing idea about maybe making pretzels that have cheese on top of it. Can they fund my new idea? The bank manager, I come in with a suit, not this. The bank manager says, yes, this is obviously good. They make a loan to me. The loan is an asset to the bank. It's also simultaneously a liability. The way they fund the loan is to credit me with a deposit. Okay, so the bank has asset and liability. I have asset, my deposit at the bank. I have liability, what I own to them. And more recently, shadow banks, which in all forms are about half of total global credit these days. Shadow banks, which normally actually should be operating in a loanable funds world, because they're not banks, have been edging into the endogenous credit creation world by getting actors out there to create collateral, which they then take to the bank and say, can you lend us money against this collateral? But they're edging into it because they're encouraging the creation of, I'll just say for the sake of argument, somewhat artificial forms of collateral, okay? So both of these processes tend to generate too much credit, and therefore they tend to generate financial crises. I don't have to remind you of that. It's still in everybody's living memory. But the logic is very simple here, and this is Minsky's logic. And for those of you who are visual learners, there's a nice chart on the next page. But the logic is very simple. I'm a bank. I make money by generating credit. If I'm a banker in the bank, I personally have an incentive to generate as much credit as possible. Nobody gets promoted if they perform below the average in the banking system. Nobody gets bonuses if they perform below average. Only in the academic world can you get bonuses for performing below average. So I have an incentive to create credit. The bank, because the CEO wants to expand market share in most cases, will reward this kind of performance. So banks are always creating more credit. And here's where we move from sociology to the economy. When I create credit for the second actor coming to me for credit, it helps validate the first loan I make. So you can imagine a world with just one bank. I make a loan to actor number one, Mr. Cheese on Pretzel person. Actor number two comes in and says, I have also a good idea. Maybe we should make something sweet, aprikosa, streusel. And the bank says, also a good idea. I create credit for you. When they do that, they're expanding aggregate demand in the economy. It helps validate that first loan, okay? So as banks make more and more loans, they help validate all the prior loans that they're making. And everybody says, wow, things are great. And it encourages ever more risky behavior because the more risk you're willing to take, the more credit gets created, the more your risk-taking behavior is rewarded, until, of course, we edge into crazy risk, which leads to the crash. Now, the central bank and the regulatory authorities can try to constrain this credit creation, but as Minsky says, that's why he enters the chat, they never are successful because the incentives here are to find ways around the regulations, which is what you're seeing with shadow banks edging into the endogenous credit creation. So this is what I just said, but with a nice chart. We have increased credit, asset prices go up if it's the financial system. Everyone expects that there'll be more increases in asset prices. Those are the collateral for the new loans, so more credit is created. It seems to validate the older credit creation. From Minsky's point of view, this is how you go from speculative finance to Ponzi. Speculative finance is finance where the bank is extending credit to someone who expects to be able to make interest and principal payments out of the cash flow from their own activity. That's Mr. Cheese Pretzel, okay? Hedge finance is credit to people who expect to be able to make interest payments from their own activity, but not principal payments. Principal repayment is a function of being able to sell the asset to some person, in parentheses you can read fool, out there, at which point, because asset prices have risen, I get a capital gain, and now I retire to the French Riviera. Ponzi finance is, so that's our apricot. Ponzi finance, which is like, I'll put cheese on top of the apricot streusel. That's gotta be great, everyone will love it, is I don't expect to be able to pay interest or principal repayment out of my cash flow. I expect to be able to flip this asset, pay back the debt, pay the accumulated interest, and still have a capital gain, which requires not just a fool in the parenthesis, but a greater fool, okay? So the Minsky cycle gives you excess credit creation and a crash. So inside money always tends towards financial crisis. And in that crisis, it's the state that provides outside money to bail out the financial system. Because the banks, when they create inside money, simultaneously create an asset and a liability, they cannot bail themselves out. Once the collateral devalues, once the apricot streusel mit Käse is a dud and nobody wants to buy them, the bank cannot loan more money to someone to buy that asset because the value of that asset, the store that makes it, which is the collateral, has devalued. In real life, 2008, this is the devaluation of mortgage-backed securities when the collateral behind them, houses, had a sharp drop in price, which then devalued the asset. The banks have these assets on their books. Now they're bankrupt because their liabilities exceed the value of their assets. In that situation, it's the state that can come in and bail them out because the state can just print money. And this is what the US Fed did in 2008. They simply said, we push some buttons, here's some money. We use that money to buy up all those bad assets at par. So now you, the bank who had this devalued mortgage-backed security, gets the full price for it. Your balance sheet is now balanced, all good. The state can do that because against this creation of debt for the state, for just printing money, is an implicit asset, which is taxes on all of us, okay? That assumes that the state actually has the ability to enforce taxation. So that's why we have, in part, a hierarchy of money inside an economy. Everybody with me so far? Okay, good. It gets tricky when we go to the international or global level. State money's at the top of domestic monetary hierarchies because the state can legitimately, at least if you're in the US and Europe, not so much Zimbabwe, state can legitimately tax the population. It can coerce payment, and therefore it can coerce use of this money. And there is some reasonable expectation that the economy will continue to function. When you get to the global level, all of this gets a little trickier. That's why it's quasi-state money or quasi-outside money. There is no tax authority on the part of the US state, although there is a transfer of resources. There's no legitimacy for the dollar as global quasi-state money in the sense that people accept its use in a kind of normal day-to-day business at the level of the Bakri, right? At the level of banks, it's a different story, right? So the dollar sits at the top of the money hierarchy. Its acceptability is a function of acceptability by financial actors narrowly. It can't tax, but the current account deficit is actually how taxation operates. We'll get to that in a minute, but the cocktail party statistic you can have in your head is that the cumulative current account deficit for the US from 1992 to 2021 is basically equivalent to official spending on defense by the US government over the same period. There is some degree in routinization, but no legal infrastructure, no monopoly of violence, and so this is why it's quasi-money. So if we think about what the dollar is really doing here, we could say it's certainly as a first step, it's sitting at the top of a whole set of pyramids of money. I steal this from Stefan Murau and Jens van de Klooster. It's not quite how I think about things, but it's easier for me to steal it than to make it. Their point is there's a whole set of domestic monetary instruments, credit instruments in the US economy, as well as in the offshore economy. Underneath and linked to this, relatively high-powered currencies. Underneath that, currencies that don't actually operate much in the international sphere. These actually do, which is one reason there's a bit of a difference. And then a bunch that are even lower. Okay, so a global hierarchy. And we can observe this in the real world because when crashes happen, what we can see is the Federal Reserve steps in and provides outside money to bail out the systems, financial systems of other countries where the creation of inside money and, this is the important connection to the mechanisms, the creation of inside money and the creation of inside money dollar denominated makes those systems vulnerable to a crash. So swaps formally are symmetrical. There are agreements to move different currencies back and forth, but in practice, they're totally asymmetrical. Here's the Federal Reserve provision of dollars in the 2008 global financial crisis, about $600 billion, less in the Eurozone crisis because it was a more narrowly euro problem, and then COVID, okay? So the Fed is dominant in crisis times. The Fed is now also dominant in normal times. And again, I steal this from Murau, who I'm working on some things with, so this is okay. So in the repo market, which we can, in one sentence, again, for those of you who don't know it, repo market is, hi, I'm illiquid today. Can you loan me some money against collateral that I can't easily sell? And I'll pay you back and buy back this collateral tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. The Fed is now providing enormous amounts of money in the repo market. So buying securities overnight or over a few days so that banks can have cash on their books and therefore look balanced. And the foreign part of that, which is a little hard to see from the back, is this green line, which you can see peaks at COVID, but still has not come down, okay? So the US dollar is quasi-state money for a global empire. To sum up, the dollar sits at the top of the monetary hierarchy, and actors prefer to denominate credit, meaning debt, in dollars. It's quasi because there's no formal taxation power, there's no formal compulsion to use the dollar, but the dollar performs these two relatively symbiotic functions. One is to help expand demand, because the US will run current account deficits. And two is to stabilize the financial system. And that's what creates the lock-in. Okay, so that's money. How does this actually, that's the theory, as the economists say, oh, this works in theory. Let's see if it works in reality. So here's mechanisms. Here's the mechanisms. If you talk to the people in the North American view, what they'll say is that people use the dollar because there's a deep and liquid capital market. It enables lots of exchanges with minimal transaction costs. The transaction costs are lower than for other currencies. And so this explains why there's persistent use of the dollar. This isn't wrong, but it's not the most important mechanism, and it's therefore misleading, okay? And this is what produces statements like that made by Barry Eichengreen, who's not an idiot, but who said, oh, look, we're in a world in which financial tech, fintech, and the fact that everybody has one of these in their pockets means they can trade currencies easily, quickly, with low transaction costs. And we would expect, therefore, that the dollar's centrality will decline because you're not locked in. Okay? And that's wrong. And that's because use of the dollar is about credit and therefore debt. And so we want to look at both sides of the coin, as it were. So here's the first side of the coin, which is cumulative current account deficits and surpluses, 1992 to 2022. Current account deficits over there on your left, surplus countries on the right. I'll call a few things out. One is, right, the US is half of cumulative deficits. The US plus the other blue, which is the other Anglo economies, is 2/3 of cumulative deficits. And then over here, surplus countries, the usual suspects: Germany, export Weltmeister, China, no surprise, Japan over the long 90s, and big oil, of course. So these folks are accumulating credits. These folks are accumulating debt, okay? And that connects directly to this also big oil, Russia, Norway, Saudi, Kuwait, Arab Emirates, Qatar, okay, Qatar. So this relationship connects to those deep and liquid capital markets, because when they're talking about this deep and liquid capital market, what they're saying is, oh yeah, look, the American Treasury bond market, it's enormous. Oh look, the American mortgage-backed security market, it's enormous. Oh look, American equities, enormous. All of those things are, of course, both assets and liabilities. If I own the Treasury bond, I have an asset. The US state has a liability. If I own the mortgage-backed security, I have an asset. Ultimately, some home buyer in the US has a liability. There's actually a lot of other actors in the chain. And so it's true that there's enormous deep liquid capital markets. You can see this in the numbers here. These are for 2021, but on average, it's a bit lower. From 2007 to 2022, the US is 38% of the fixed asset market. The EU is about 25%, and the US is about 36% of equities by market cap, and the EU is about 12%, right? But this is the other way to think about that surplus deficit situation, okay? So first step here, we've gone from these trade balances to the actual assets that underlie that. And then when we ask, what are those assets in the US? And when you look at the fixed equity market, I'll have more to say about, fixed income market. I'll have more to say about equities in the third lecture. But when you look at the fixed income market, what you see is the fixed income market is the US state. The fixed income asset pool is the US state. The US part of the fixed asset pool is the US state. 77% of fixed income by value is treasury bonds, mortgage-backed securities, which used to be theoretically private, but are now public once again because Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have been nationalized. The actual direct debt of those housing agencies, and then the municipal bond market, that's state and local debt. So here what you are seeing is, hi, we're the world. We sell things to the Americans. They give us back pieces of paper. What are those pieces of paper? On the fixed income side, there are promises from the US state that it will actually be able to tax me despite my best efforts. And so they're essentially accepting this public debt. Okay. And this comes out also clearly when you look at holdings. So foreign holdings of US securities, again on the left, American holdings of foreign securities on the right. It looks like foreigners hold a lot more corporates than they do treasuries. But again, if we just go back a second, the corporate market is substantially smaller than the treasury market. What you see here is that this lower percentage of foreign holdings is about 10.5% of the fixed income market. And this seemingly larger is actually about 8%. So again, there's a big bet on the capacity of the US state to actually operate. Americans, by contrast, as I said about 12 years ago, prefer equities to fixed income. More about that later. Okay, so step one, current account deficits, current surpluses. What actually is being represented here are assets and liabilities. Okay, we could say maybe these actors trust the US state to be able to tax people, but why just continuously accumulate these assets, given that American public debt, because it's at the top of the monetary hierarchy, typically yields less than other countries? Why accumulate public debt, which typically yields less than the other instruments, right, like corporates or equities? Why accumulate all of these assets, given that, as Honecker, et cetera, show very nicely for Germany, the long-term return is lower on these external assets than you might get in your internal market, right? It doesn't quite make sense. Now, before I move on, I want to put another asterisk in. When you look at this is deceptive. And it's deceptive because this and this actually inflate foreign holdings. Some of the largest foreign holders of US Treasury debt and US corporate debt are Microsoft, Apple, Google. Microsoft holds $100 billion of American Treasury debt, but Microsoft Seattle is not holding those. It's Microsoft Ireland or Cayman Islands that holds them. In the statistics that are behind this, it shows up as a foreign holding. So this overstates the degree to which foreigners hold US equities, but nonetheless, and fixed income, but nonetheless, they do tell us something. Okay, so why? Let's go back to this question of system and units. And here, Klein and Pettis, how many people know this book? Okay, so I'll say a few words. A really good book. You should go read it. It's really interesting. They have a very simple argument, which I will translate into my frame of reference, because they don't quite get to the system level thing here. But the system level thing is that historically and today in the global economy, we have countries that enter the market late. They're relatively backward. They all want to get rich. So you have a whole set of late developers. And we can break late developers into two groups, those that are successful, those that are not. The successful late developers are the ones that generate these huge current account surpluses, Germany, Japan, Korea, China, okay? In order to be successful, they have to repress domestic demand because they need to generate net exports in order to get growth. And the steps here are here in this list, okay? Put the oil economies aside, look at the export surplus economies that are successful. What's going on? They want to do late development. Because they're doing late development, they're starting off poor. They're poor in human capital. They're poor in physical capital. They're poor in terms of local aggregate demand. In order to be able to import the machines that they need to actually capitalize their economies so they can become modern, they have to concentrate financial resources. For those of you who know Gerschenkron, this is just Gerschenkron with a system level spin. They need to concentrate financial resources. The way they do that is to repress domestic demand. Household consumption in China, about 40% of GDP. That's repression of domestic demand, okay? You squeeze local consumption. When you're squeezing local consumption, you're taking the physical output of the economy and exporting it. That gives you money. Money allows you to import capital goods. And You do invest that in the latest, greatest production technology, if possible. That technology requires large economies of scale to be profitable. And here's where you have the problem. You've repressed domestic demand. You need to get economies of scale. There's a problem there. You can't sell enough in your own market in order to actually get to those economies of scale. So you're going to have to export. And this is what gives you export surges and surpluses from these late developers. And because you're competing on price in world markets, you're pushing prices down, which is what gives you global deflation. That's a problem, right? This is what drives use of the dollar ultimately. So here's the local version of this, but more generally, we can look at the numbers on this. So here's our top 12 deficit countries from the chart back a little bit. Here's our top 12 surplus countries, a little bit disaggregated. An unweighted average, right? Consumption in these export surplus economies is systematically lower. If we actually weighted, because China is so big, this number would be lower. And if we actually weighted here, it would be higher because the US is a lot larger than all these other economies. Okay, so you have demand repression that results in net exports in order to get profitability for these companies and also to get growth. We can see this a different way if you look at the expansion of private final consumption from 92 forward. This is an index, 92 is 100, right? German consumption growth, modest compared to the US or Australia. And that's not because Germany is uniquely, spectacularly successful at exporting. The black line and the heavier blue line are export growth, again, indexed in 91 for the US and for Germany. And there's not much difference aside from conjunctural things. Germany lags on exports during the reunification era. Germany overperforms on exports in the China expansion era, okay? But essentially, what you're seeing is a repression of domestic demand in order to get growth. And I have more on that again in the third lecture. And this is what leads to the accumulation of dollars. If I need net exports to be profitable, if I need net exports to get growth, because I'm repressing domestic demand, I'm going to accumulate dollars. I'm going to accumulate something financially, which is the counterpart to the export surplus. So what am I going to do with that money? If I do what economists think I should do, which is go to the foreign exchange market, exchange dollars for euro, what's going to happen, because I've got a surplus, is that the exchange rate is going to worsen for me. My currency will appreciate, which makes it harder to export. So I'm not going to do that. I don't want that, as Martin will tell you. Or I can recycle that money and buy assets denominated in the importer's currency, which maintains undervaluation, and then I can keep exporting. So I accumulate assets. First thing that does is it gives me an incentive to make sure the dollar doesn't devalue. I'm accumulating all these dollar-denominated assets. I don't want them to crash. Okay. If you're not a successful developer, you'll be borrowing money to import stuff. And here's where you can start to see how you get endogenous credit creation as well as recycling of dollars that lock in both the export surplus countries and the non-Anglo import surplus countries. Hi, I'm VW, whatever, I'm BMW. I've accumulated extra dollars in the world market. The Chinese pay me in dollars, the Americans pay me in dollars, everyone pays me in dollars. I put the money into D-Bank. D-Bank has to do something with it. They lend it to the other import surplus countries, the other trade deficit countries, and they're loaning in dollars, okay? Because they're certainly not going to lend in Argentine pesos. And so now I'm a bank and I've got balance sheet for my cross-border lending that has a very high percentage of dollar-denominated assets and liabilities, okay? You'll skip that because I just said it. I'm going to skip this because we're going to run out of time. But the result is that non-US banking systems get locked into a dollar-denominated world in both normal and crisis times, like I showed you, because their balance sheets are populated with dollars. Numbers, because you don't have to trust me on this. Ronald Reagan is right, trust but verify. So I haven't updated this, but hasn't changed. This is who originates cross-border lending denominated in dollars. Most of it is non-US banks. Global cross-border lending is dollar-denominated lending, both recycling and endogenous credit creation by non-US banks. When you look at liabilities by currency, what you see is, so this is just dollars, right? What does that look like in terms of the aggregate? About half of lending is in dollars. A big chunk is in euro. But of course, from the point of view of a system level approach, when Belgian banks loan money to Dutch flour producers in euro, that's not really cross-border lending anymore. It's essentially an internal transaction. If you net out transactions inside the Eurozone, again, sorry, this one's not updated. It's more difficult. You see that most lending outside the Eurozone is dollar denominated. And that's what gives you this, which is what percentage of cross-border liabilities for banks are dollar denominated. Unsurprisingly for the US, it's very high because we operate natively in dollars. What is surprising is how high it is for everybody else. Canada, okay, it's the 13th Federal Reserve District. Switzerland is the American portal into Europe. But if we look at the EU8, which is these guys, and this is back when the UK was still in the EU, what you see is it's about a third of lending. And because of that, banks are vulnerable. Banks are fundamentally vulnerable. As we saw in 2008, they cannot natively create dollars. The ECB cannot natively create dollars, Bank of Japan, et cetera. And so you are stuck with the US Fed as the central bank for the world. Okay, we're going to skip this. We're going to skip this. Why does this matter? Outside the US, banks are critical for financing the economy. So this is domestic credit to private sector from the banking system as a percentage of GDP, 17 to 21 on average. You can see most countries, it's much higher percentage of GDP. So that's volume. And then the share, bank credit to the non-financial sectors, again, higher than in the US. So you're locked into a financial hierarchy where the dollar is at the top. If banks fail, the economy crashes, and this is what makes them reliant on the Fed. So this is the second factor. First factor is if I need growth, I have to export. When I do that, to get net exports, I've got to do it in dollars and recycle that money. And in emergencies, that means because I have dollars on my balance sheet, I've got to go to the Fed. That's why you have this, right? And that's why you have this. Okay, so I'll take questions now.